What's going on YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is Dr. Charles P. Winston at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind, this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. The world witnessed two pivotal conferences in the 20th century, each embodying contrasting visions of global order. These conferences, though separated by decades and continents, were deeply interconnected in their impact on the world stage. In the heart of Europe, the Berlin Conference saw European powers convene to carve up Africa for their colonial ambitions. This gathering was not just a meeting, but a calculated move to establish control over vast territories and resources with little regard for the indigenous populations. For 14 weeks and 5 days between November 15th, 1884, and February 26th, 1885, European countries prepared and cooked their plans on how to share Africa like a piece of pie. The demons picked Al-Kaaba land apart piece by piece. It was at this conference in Berlin, present-day Germany, that so-called African lands were divided on a map, while the Africans themselves were exempted from the meeting. It was not an omission of invitation or a simple oversight, but rather it was a large-scale legalized daylight robbery. Africans were considered irrelevant and incapable of making meaningful decisions on what happened to or on their lands. Since they were uncivilized and savages, according to these European invaders, they needed help, and the participants of the Berlin Conference were to be their saviors, their Jesus. Towns, lands and rivers were all portrayed on the map that hung on the wall with just a ruler, and pencil borders were formed, territories were claimed, and trade routes were created or removed, while historical background, cultural laws, sovereignty and traditional institutions of a people dating back thousands of years were completely ignored. And just like a piece of cake, Africa, the second largest continent in the world, was shed at a conference table. The Berlin Conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first Chancellor of the new German Empire, who was concerned with securing portions of the continent within which exploration had begun. The conference birthed the General Act of the Berlin Conference, which had been nicknamed the Scramble for Africa. The conference consisted of top European nations who were invested in exploring the resources that abound within the continent. This was justified under the guise of civilizing or developing the countries which they considered barbarian and primitive. This paved the way for the colonization of the African states by the Western countries and eventually robbed a continent of its rich cultural heritage and linguistic diversity. By the time most of these countries would gain independence from their colonial masters during the 20th century, great damage had already been done. The structures and systems that had been laid down by the colonizing nations made inadequate provision for self-sufficiency and thus had a great dependency on their colonizers for survival. So how did the Berlin Conference come to be, and what impact did it have on Africa as a whole? King Leopold of Belgium's civilization agenda. There was a general belief by the Europeans that Africa belonged to no one in particular and had to be claimed and developed. When the Berlin Conference took place, no African individual or leader was present. Ironically, Africa had experienced a great deal of development before the Europeans. By the 13th century, different empires within Africa had attained global prominence, drawing the attention and curiosity of the Western world. Some stories about the level of wealth contained within the continent seemed too good to be true. But with the discovery of the Congo River Basin in 1874 by Henry Morton Stanley, there was certainty about Africa and its rich resources. One of the leaders who was very interested in these discoveries was King Lopez II of Belgium. Leopold had previously formed the International African Society, which had a mission of civilizing Africa. He teamed up with Stanley and eventually created the International Congo Society. This was similar to the former society, but had more goals added to be achieved by the society. But Leopold was far from business in Siemens. He was a strategic and cunning leader who wanted to advance his personal wealth with Africa's resources. He began sending explorers who doubled as his representatives in laying claims over a wide expanse of land at the center of the continent and the cause of his civilization agenda for Africa. He secretly bought off investors in the International Congo Society. Stanley went to the area to try to establish the Congo Free State. This was while other European nations were also in the scramble for Congo. France, on discovering Leopold's hidden agenda, sent their own explorer Pierre Savagnin de Brazza, who created Brazzaville and mounted the French flag. While Portugal laid claims as well on the Congo area, which they backed by treaty signed with leaders of the ancient Congo kingdom. Other European countries began taking interest in a continent of gold they had heard rumors about, and this resulted in competition and great conflict between these nations that were claiming different regions of Africa. Great Britain and France were both having conflicts over West Africa, Portugal in Egypt, and Britain in East Africa. Leopold and the French also had conflicts in Central Africa over the Congo area. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, whose country was considered an imperial power, also picked up interest in laying claims to African lands. He sought to resolve these conflicts by calling for the Berlin Conference. Bismarck felt these conflicts arose because there was no equal distribution of access to the economic advantage Africa provided, and called for the conference to resolve these irregularities. This proves that the purpose of the Berlin Conference was largely economical, and not for developing the African states countries such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire were represented at a conference. The conference began on November 15, 1884, and went on for 14 weeks and 5 days, ending on February 26 of 1885. In the Berlin Conference, territories claimed by European countries were to be legalized, formalized, and then drawn on the map to avoid further conflict. Trade rules were also agreed upon amidst colonies, and a framework for colonizing territories was created. Explorers were to be sent out to explore the African land. Then they would proceed to offer protection to the indigenous people of that land by signing treaties with them. Finally, the European explorers or ambassadors would return to their home country with the treaties signed. Then the government of that country would inform or negotiate with other European countries so that their claim over the African territory would be recognized and uncontested. In all of these establishments, Africans were not included or considered, although it was their land that was being divided. They were regarded as incapable of ruling themselves. It would also be interesting to note that most of the time the indigenous rulers did not even understand what the treaty was about or what they were signing. In some scenarios, these treaties were signed by makeshift leaders who did not exactly have the authority to do so. However, one African leader saw through the tricks of the Europeans. Menelik, an important leader in Ethiopia, who would eventually become emperor, wrote a letter to the participants of the conference, clearly stating that Ethiopia would not be needing their protection. Although his letter was ignored, Ethiopia and Liberia were the only African states that were not colonized in the scramble. The Sultan of Zanzibar begged to be present at the conference, but to no avail. Little did he know that he was to be part of the main topic of discussion. Decades later, on the soil of a newly independent Indonesia, the Bandung Conference of 1955 emerged as a direct response to the legacies of colonialism and a beacon of hope for a different future. The Bandung Conference was to counter the Berlin Conference. This conference was a bold statement against the injustices of the past and a call for a new era of equality and mutual respect among nations. The Bandung Conference marked a turning point in history, offering a platform for newly independent nations to challenge the existing world order. It was a gathering of leaders who had fought for their country's freedom and were now determined to ensure that their voices were heard on the global stage. It was a moment of profound significance, as nations that had long been subjected to colonial rule came together to assert their agency and chart their own destiny. The sense of unity and purpose at Bandung was palpable, as leaders from diverse backgrounds found common ground in their shared experiences of oppression and their aspirations for a better future. The Bandung Conference, also known as the Asian-African Conference, was a meeting of 29 Asian and African countries in Bandung, Indonesia in April 1955. The conference aimed to promote peace and cooperation and to end colonialism and imperialism. It also discussed the role of the Third World in the Cold War, economic development and decolonization. The conference was chaired by Indonesian Prime Minister Ali Sastro-Amidjojo, and Indonesian President Sukarno gave the opening address. Other attendees included African-American author Richard Wright and Democratic Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. The conference had a psychological impact, highlighting the fundamental rights of colonized peoples and their resistance to European domination. It also led to the emergence of a non-aligned movement. The United States initially viewed the conference with caution, concerned that it was a sign of a leftward shift in the newly independent nations. However, the conference did not lead to a general denunciation of the West. A general denunciation refers to a public and widespread condemnation or criticism of someone or something, often aimed at deterring others from engaging in similar behavior by making the negative consequences of such actions widely known. Essentially, a strong public statement of disapproval intended to serve as a warning to the broader community. The conference stood in stark contrast to the Berlin Conference, which had epitomized the era of European imperialism. The Berlin Conference was a meeting where European powers established rules for dividing up Africa and claiming its resources. The purpose of the conference was held to formalize claims to African colonies and avoid conflict between European powers. The conference was attended by representatives from 14 European countries, which are corporations, the United States Corporation and the Ottoman Empire. No African representatives were present. The conference established the General Act of the Conference, which included the principle of effective occupation. When one country has a military presence in another country for a prolonged period of time, usually after or during a war. For example, the United States occupied Japan after World War II. In international humanitarian law, a territory is considered occupied when it is under the authority of a foreign armed force. The occupying force is generally required to restore and maintain law and order while respecting the laws in force. This principle stated that a country could only claim a territory if it had treaties with local leaders, established an administration, and flew its flag there. The conference also resolved to end slavery by African and Islamic powers, though this resolution was non-binding. The conference accelerated the process of colonialism in Africa, which is known as the Scramble for Africa. The conference was based on racist ideas and the exploitation of African people and resources. While Berlin was about division and domination, Bandung was about unity and liberation. The spectre of Berlin loomed large over Bandung. The memories of exploitation and the struggle for independence were fresh in the minds of the delegates, serving as a powerful reminder of what they were fighting against. The Berlin Conference had set the stage for decades of exploitation and oppression, leaving deep scars on the African continent. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers had led to conflicts and suffering that would last for generations. Bandung represented a rejection of this colonial legacy, a collective declaration that the era of subjugation was over. The conference was a powerful statement of intent, signaling that the newly independent nations were ready to take their rightful place in the world. At Bandung, the formerly colonized nations of Asia and Africa gathered not to divide territory, but to forge a new path based on solidarity and cooperation. They sought to build a world where mutual respect and understanding would replace the old dynamics of power and control. It was a moment of profound symbolic importance, signaling the rise of a new global consciousness and the waning of colonial dominance. The Bandung Conference was not just a meeting, It was a movement, a declaration that the world was changing and that the voices of the formerly oppressed would no longer be silenced. The Berlin Conference stands as a stark reminder of the brutal history of European colonialism. This gathering of European powers was not just a meeting, it was a calculated move to assert dominance over an entire continent. Driven by greed and a sense of racial superiority, European powers gathered to divide the African continent amongst themselves. The conference was a manifestation of the imperialistic ambitions that had been brewing for decades. The conference formalized the scramble for Africa, a period of intense competition among European nations to claim and exploit African territories. This scramble was not just about land, it was about resources, power and prestige. The conference room in Berlin became a stage for the dismantling of a continent. The decisions made within those walls would reverberate across Africa for generations to come. With maps spread out before them, European diplomats drew lines across the African continent, carving out colonies with little regard for existing ethnic or cultural boundaries. These arbitrary lines would later become the borders of modern African nations. The voices of the African people, the rightful inhabitants of the land, were conspicuously absent from these deliberations. Their fate was decided without their consent, a stark illustration of the colonial mindset. The Berlin Conference resulted in the almost complete colonization of Africa. European flags were planted across the continent, symbolizing the new order imposed by foreign powers. By the turn of the 20th century, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. These nations stood as rare exceptions in a continent otherwise dominated by European rule. This division of Africa had devastating consequences for the continent. Entire communities were uprooted and traditional ways of life were disrupted. It led to the displacement of populations, the destruction of traditional economies, and the systematic exploitation of African resources. The wealth extracted from Africa fueled the industrial growth of Europe, while the continent itself was left impoverished. The legacy of the Berlin Conference continued to cast a long shadow over Africa long after the formal end of colonial rule. The scars of colonialism are still visible in the political, social and economic fabric of many African nations. The arbitrary borders drawn in Berlin created artificial divisions within African societies, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. These borders often split ethnic groups and force together communities with little in common, leading to tensions that persist to this day. The economic structures put in place during the colonial era left many African nations dependent on their former colonizers, hindering their ability to achieve true economic independence. The exploitation of resources and labor created a cycle of dependency that has been difficult to break. Today, African nations continue to grapple with the legacies of the Berlin Conference. Efforts to address the historical injustices and build a more equitable future are ongoing, but the path is fraught with challenges. Despite these challenges, the resilience and strength of African communities shine through. The continent's rich cultural heritage and the determination of its people offer hope for a brighter future. As Africa continues to rise, it is essential to remember the lessons of the past. The Berlin Conference serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition and the importance of respecting the sovereignty and dignity of all peoples. What was the General Act? The General Act was the outcome of the Berlin Conference, and it made provisions for different trade routes and the framework for colonization. It addressed different issues bordering on the colonization of the African states. It confirmed the Congo Free State as the private property of King Leopold II, and also confirmed the free trade proposal by making the Niger and Congo rivers free for ship traffic. The General Act also included the signing of the international prohibition of the slave trade. More importantly, it established the principle of effectivity, which stated that powers could only possess colonies if they actually possessed them. This also meant that any country which wanted possession of any territory in Africa would notify other signatory powers for formalization and recognition. The Berlin Conference was a glaring disregard for Africans. The Europeans saw their views, opinions and ownership over their lands as irrelevant. 14 countries were duly represented at the conference, and at its conclusion, 8 out of the 14 countries started possessing different parts of the African regions. The 6 other participants, such as Austria-Hungary, Russia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway and the United States, did not take any formal possession of any parts of Africa. However, by the end of the 19th century, all African states except Ethiopia and Liberia had been colonized by the Europeans. The echoes of the Berlin Conference reverberated throughout the 20th century, shaping the political and economic landscape of the world. The colonial system established at Berlin created a global hierarchy, with European powers at the top and colonized nations relegated to the bottom. This system of exploitation had a profound impact on the economies of colonized nations. Raw materials were extracted from Africa, Asia and Latin America to fuel European industries, while manufactured goods were shipped back to the colonies. This unequal exchange of goods and resources enriched the colonizers at the expense of the colonized. The psychological impact of colonialism was equally devastating. Colonial powers sought to justify their rule by propagating racist ideologies that portrayed colonized peoples as inferior and incapable of self-governance. This internalized racism eroded the self-esteem of colonized populations, creating a sense of dependency and inferiority. By the mid-20th century, however, the tide began to turn. The horrors of World War II, coupled with the rise of nationalist movements within colonized nations, weakened European colonialism. Across Asia and Africa, people rose up to demand their independence, challenging the very foundations of the colonial order. The scramble for Africa. After the Berlin Conference ended in 1885, it led to the creation of African countries by forcefully merging different ethnic groups, cultures, languages, and people. This, of course, overrode the existing groupings, boundaries, and regions within the continent. The conference legalized what was not legal and created a grant for cooperation between the European countries on taking over the African states. The European countries claimed to offer protection to the countries they overtook. The 1884 and 1885 Berlin Conference would not only be the birthplace of colonization, but also the conflicts within and without countries, state and ethnic groups that still exist to this day. The robbery did not only end with land and territories, but also cultural artifacts, treasures and resources yet to be regained by the continent. It was obvious that the Europeans were wolves in sheep's clothing, thrilled by the desire for acquiring Africa's natural resources for the betterment of their countries. As such, there was a need to secure their portions to maintain their industrial sector, which was just starting to grow. To achieve this, they had to secure African territories that would readily provide them with the resources they needed and a market for the goods they produced. A total of 50 countries were carved out of the scramble for Africa. Great Britain took control of Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Nigeria, and Ghana. France took a better part of Western Africa, from Mauritania to Chad and also Gabon, and the Republic of Congo, Belgium, and King Leopold II controlled the Democratic Republic of Congo. While Portugal took Mozambique in the east and Angola in the west, Italy got hold of Somalia, then known as Italian Somaliland, and a portion of Ethiopia later on. Germany took Cameroon, Namibia and Tanzania, while Spain got the smallest territory, which was Equatorial Guinea, the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. In April 1955, as the sun rose over the city of Bandung, Indonesia, a new chapter in world history was about to be written. The streets of Bandung were bustling with an energy that was palpable, as people from all walks of life gathered to witness a historic event. 29 nations, representing over half the world's population, gathered together for the Asian-African Conference, later known as the Bandung Conference. Delegates arrived with a sense of purpose, their faces reflecting the weight of the momentous occasion. This gathering marked a watershed moment in the struggle against colonialism. It was a bold statement against the centuries of oppression and exploitation that many of these nations had endured. For the first time, nations that had long been subjected to European domination came together to assert their collective voice on the world stage. Leaders who had fought tirelessly for their country's independence now stood side by side, united in their quest for a new world order. The conference was a powerful symbol of the emerging post-colonial order, a beacon of hope for millions who had long been silenced. The speeches given were not just words, they were declarations of intent filled with passion and resolve. It was a testament to the resilience and determination of those who had fought for their freedom. The stories of struggle and triumph echoed through the halls, reminding everyone of the sacrifices that had been made. The atmosphere in Bandung was electric, charged with a sense of hope and anticipation. The city became a melting pot of ideas and cultures as people celebrated the dawn of a new era. Delegates from diverse backgrounds, representing a wide range of cultures, languages and religions, came together with a shared purpose: to forge a new path for their nations, free from the shackles of colonialism. They engaged in deep discussions, sharing their visions for a future where their people could thrive. To forge a new path for their nations, free from the shackles of colonialism. The agreements signed were more than just documents, they were commitments to a shared future, built on mutual respect and cooperation. The Bandung Conference was more than just a diplomatic gathering, it was a cultural awakening, a celebration of the rich diversity of Asian and African civilizations. It was a platform where the voices of the marginalized could finally be heard. It was a cultural awakening, a moment where the beauty and richness of their heritage were showcased with pride. Traditional dances and music performances added a vibrant layer to the proceedings, reminding everyone of the cultural wealth that had been suppressed for so long. A celebration of the rich diversity of Asian and African civilizations. Art and cultural exhibits displayed the creativity and ingenuity of these civilizations, offering a glimpse into their storied pasts and promising futures. It was a moment for the formerly colonized to reclaim their narratives, to redefine themselves on their own terms. The leaders spoke with conviction, their words resonating with the dreams and aspirations of millions, to redefine themselves on their own terms and to forge a new path for the future. The raising of national flags symbolized the dawn of a new era, one where these nations would chart their own destinies and to forge a new path for the future. As the conference drew to a close, there was a sense of accomplishment and optimism. Leaders shook hands not just as diplomats but as partners in a shared journey towards a brighter future. How did the Berlin Conference affect Africa? The Berlin Conference, which lasted for over 3 months, still evaded serious problems and questions that were left unanswered. Many of the representatives had not stepped foot on African soil and somehow assumed they could understand and manage the complexities of the African states. The sovereignty of the African state was not recognized. Yet treaties were needed to be signed to legalize the relationship between both parties. This in itself was contradictory to the claims of the European states. Although the General Act seemed to prohibit the slave trade, it is on record that over 10 million Africans in the Congo area died under Leopold's leadership due to starvation, diseases and war. The act was used to gain approval and legitimacy in the public eye by the European countries, but did not in any way elevate the sufferings and conditions of the locals. Under their colonial masters, the locals were brutalized and used to further his selfish interest. The concept of free trade was unrealistic, as many of the colonizing countries would not readily allow free trade within countries they had invested heavily in colonizing. For instance, the Congo was operated as a monopoly under Leopold's rule. The conference, we tried to curb the scramble for Africa, further enhanced. It was presented as a means of creating a platform for peaceful claiming of African states by European states, but it also had its hidden agenda. Germany and Britain were interested in Africa to promote their ambitions and retain their position as the #1 global power over the others, and not for peaceful colonization, as assumed. What impact did the Berlin Conference have on Africa? The Berlin Conference holds entirely different consequences for the continent involved for Europe. It was just a failed enterprise, while in Africa it created long-lasting damage that is still visible to this day. Some of the damages done by colonization have been said to be too large to be repaired even after gaining independence. Most of these colonized African countries are still ill-equipped to be well run by themselves. Greed and corruption are the order of the day, and conflict still exists within the African borders. Some African diplomats have called for redrawing the African map and redefining the boundaries laid by the colonial masters. But there are also fears that this might aggravate an already politically tense climate. These fears have created another group of the opinion that the colonial boundaries be respected. Nevertheless, this does not suffice for the damages that run deeper in the cracks within the continent. It has been 137 years since the Berlin Conference ended, and one can only help but wonder if Africa would ever recover from the effect of the European invasion and plunder. Next video. We always have more stories like this to talk about, so do not hesitate to like and share this video with your friends. You can subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to receive the latest videos as they drop also. If you would like to know more about the difference between French and British colonialism in Africa, do check out our next video.